अस्सलाम वालेकुम। प्रोग्राम एम्बेसी रोड में खुश आमदीद। नाज़रीन, आज हमारे मेहमान हैं पाकिस्तान में फ़्रांस के सफ़ीर मोहतरम फ़िलिप थीबू, और हम उनसे बात करेंगे पाकिस्तान और फ़्रांस के ताल्लुकात के हवाले से। उसके अलावा पाकिस्तान और फ़्रांस के दरमियान जो माशी ताउन है वो बहुत अरसे से जारी है। पाकिस्तान और फ़्रांस के दरमियान दिफाई शोबे में भी बड़ा ताउन जारी रहा है और अब भी है, और पाकिस्तान की दिफाई ज़रूरियात फ़्रांस ने बड़ी हद तक हमेशा पूरी की है और इन दोनों ममालिक में बहुत ताउन रहा है। मुख्तलिफ़ शोबों में पाकिस्तान की माशी इमदाद भी की है फ़्रांस ने। हम फ़्रांस के सफ़ीर मोहतरम से इन्हीं इशूज़ पर बात करेंगे और उनसे पूछेंगे कि पाकिस्तान और फ़्रांस के ताल्लुकात मुस्तकबिल में कैसे होंगे। Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us in this program.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much, and good evening
Thank
to you and to all people listening to this program.
Thank you. Ambassador, Pakistan and France have been friends. They have had cooperative relations for the last 6 decades. So how do you look at the relations now at this juncture?
Well, as you just mentioned, this relationship has developed over more than 60 years now, and it is a very mature relationship encompassing all areas of cooperation. And really, nowadays, we have a multifaceted relationship dealing with politics, economics, culture, science, and, of course, common international commitments. As far as politics is concerned, President Zardari met with President Sarkozy in the past years. Prime Minister Guilani visited Paris in May 2011. It was a very successful visit. Our two Ministers for Foreign Affairs in March 2012, this year, met in London in the margin of an international conference and had a meeting which enabled to review all the scope of the bilateral relation between our two countries. So I'm quite confident that we will, with the new government which was elected on the 6th of May, we will continue to develop and to enhance this relation. We have a very strong economic cooperation between the two countries. The Pakistani-French Business Alliance, which is one of the largest gathering of companies here in Pakistan, is encompassing 171 companies, which shows that French companies and Pakistani companies have a lot in common. Last year, in 2011, the volume of trade between the two countries reached a level of $1.5 billion, with a very sharp increase in Pakistani exports to France. And Pakistan is enjoying with France a trade surplus of more than $250 million, which I think is a very positive note for the Pakistani economy.
Sorry, Ambassador, the French president was to visit Pakistan following the visit of the Prime Minister, and we were expecting that former President Sarkozy will come to Pakistan, but it didn't materialize. What was the reason?
Well, I think former President Sarkozy was the president of the G8 and the G20 in 2011. And he really devoted a lot of time to meet with the leaders of those two gatherings. It was very exceptional for one country to have at the same time the double presidency of G8 and G20. And as you are aware, Europe, Eurozone, have been facing some major crisis in 2011. So we have been really contemplating a completely unexpected number of EU summit, EU gathering, bilateral meetings between President Sarkozy and Chancellor Merkel. So I think President Sarkozy has really an international agenda which was really completely changed by all those unexpected commitments due to the need to tackle the euro crisis. And then we began with the electoral campaign in France at the beginning of 2012. So I think unfortunately it was not possible to materialize this visit due to all those changes in his international agenda.
You mentioned cooperation in the field of commerce and trade and economy. What are the prospects of expanding the current volume of trade between France and Pakistan, and what are the areas where the French investors can come and invest in Pakistan?
Well, we have, by the time being, a stockpile of French direct investment in Pakistan of around $1.5 billion, which make us among the 5 largest foreign investors in Pakistan. These investments have really covering a wide range of areas. We have investment in the area of energy. We have investments in the area of pharmaceutical with Sanofi, which is one of the largest pharmaceutical group, in the area of cosmetics with L'Oréal, which began to invest in Pakistan in 2009. It is really expanding its activity very fastly. We have investments in the area of retail. Carrefour, which is one of the world's largest retailer, French company, has invested here in cooperation with a group from the Emirates under the brand Hyperstar, and they are developing quite well their activities in Karachi, in Lahore. We have Total, which is a French group of oil and refinery, Lafarge, concrete and cement. So in all areas we have French companies present here. We have more than 40 French companies developing their activities in Pakistan, and I think they do recognize that Pakistan potentially is a huge market. Nowadays it is a very large market with 180 million consumers. By 2030 it will be a market of 250 million people, probably the fourth largest population in the world. So I think French companies do realize the need for them to be present here and now in Pakistan in order to meet the needs of Pakistani consumers and in order to prepare further expansion in the country.
Pakistan is looking for a greater access to European markets. France is one of very important members of European Union. What are the prospects of the expansion of the exports, Pakistani exports, especially the textile exports to France and other countries?
Well, I think the prospect was good. As I mentioned, Pakistani export to France increased by 25% in 2011, and 85% of those exports are textiles and leather goods, so it is a fact. Second, the EU has granted to Pakistan a waiver within the WTO, the World Trade Organization, for exports in 2012 and 2013, which should help to boost Pakistani export towards the European Union. And we are certainly quite convinced that those exports are going to increase. And beyond 2014, there are discussions between Pakistan and the European Union on the so-called GSP Plus mechanism, which could give a very stable framework for Pakistani exchange with the EU. Of course, there are some conditions attached to it, more especially the full respect by Pakistan of some international conventions. Well, some very positive steps have been taken by the Pakistani government, but I think we are within the engagement plan which was agreed by the European Union for the 5 years to come. We have the basis for a real increase in economic and trade cooperation between Pakistan and the European Union.
Pakistan and France are facing a common enemy, which is terrorism. And how do you look at Pakistan's role against terrorism and extremism that has hit the world in the last few decades?
Well, I think, as you just mentioned, we are facing common challenges, and we can see that there is now a continuum of crises from Africa to Afghanistan to Pakistan. So France and Pakistan are fighting against terrorism, and it is a common challenge we have all to face. I think we have been cooperating with Pakistan in many areas in this fight against terror. Well, Pakistan, by the time being, is a member of the Security Council for the biennium 2012-2013, and there is a lot of cooperation, discussions going on within the UN Security Council. We have bilateral cooperation. European Union has also specific programs of cooperation with Pakistan in this war against terror. And I think we are sharing a lot of experiences, of information. We have here some programs of training, of support.
Training to the Pakistani authorities, the police and intelligence people.
Yeah. So I think in all those areas we have cooperation, and we certainly do recognize the commitment of Pakistan. And I think France has been involved in Afghanistan in this war against terror. We do recognize Pakistan has paid a very high price in this war against terror. We also have paid a very high price. So I think it is our common interest to have peace and stability in Pakistan, of course for the benefit of Pakistani people, but also for the regional stability and for the international security.
Ambassador will continue this discussion. नाज़रीन एक मुख्तसर ब्रेक लेते हैं और ब्रेक से वापसी के बाद हम पाकिस्तान में फ्रांस के सफ़ीर से पाकिस्तान और फ्रांस के ताल्लुकात, दहशतगर्दी के ख़िलाफ़ जंग में दोनों मालिक के ताउन और मुस्तक़बिल के इम्कानात पर बातचीत जारी रखें। Welcome back. Ambassador, the new French president has announced that France will pull out its troops from Afghanistan. How do you look at this decision and what are the implications of the withdrawal of French troops from Afghanistan?
Well, the newly elected French president, François Hollande, announced during the campaign he would withdraw combating or fighting forces before the end of 2012. He, of course, attended the NATO summit, which was held in Chicago on the 20th and the 21st of May, and he confirmed during this meeting that all combating forces would be withdrawn by 2012. Of course, it's a decision we are taking in full consultation with our NATO allies and partners and with all countries involved, with the Afghan government, with all the head of states and government, including Pakistan, who attended this summit. We do consider that it's part of a process where we are progressively giving the responsibility to the Afghan forces. And in the area where the French fighting forces were, in Kapisa Valley, progressively the Afghan forces have taken the responsibility, and we will continue to be supportive of this process before the end of 2012. We have decided to withdraw fighting forces, which means that we will still have some military presence in Afghanistan beyond 2012 for training, basically, of Afghan forces. So it's something which is a decision which is implemented progressively in full consultation and coordination with the Afghan government and with our NATO partners, and in a way which of course enable us to continue to give support and training to the Afghan forces. We entered into a partnership agreement in January 2012 when President Karzai visited France, and this agreement was signed at that time. And of course, all the provision regarding cooperation, training and assistance will be fully implemented.
But Ambassador, some critics are of the view that this decision of withdrawing French troops from Afghanistan can create some misgivings, misunderstandings between France and its NATO allies.
I think, as I mentioned, there was a proper consultation and coordination. Once again, what we are doing is what was agreed by the NATO partners in 2009 and in the Lisbon summit, when it was agreed that there would be a progressive transfer of responsibility to the Afghan forces. In the Kapisa area, where the French soldiers were basically stationed, this transfer of responsibility had begun before and will be fully implemented before the end of 2012. So we are abiding by our commitments. We have been present in Afghanistan for more than 11 years. So we do consider we have done our part of the job, and we are acting in a way which is perfectly consistent with the commitments we have taken and in full cooperation with our NATO partners.
Ambassador, do you think that deadline set by NATO of the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, which is 2014, is it a realistic deadline, or you think that things will not be okay in Afghanistan till that time and they may have to stay longer than they have scheduled to go and to withdraw?
We took a decision during this NATO summit. When I say we, I don't mean France only, but all NATO allies took this decision, and we have been progressively transferring responsibility to the Afghan forces. And by the time being, I see no reason why we should question the viability of this scheme. I think, on the very contrary, if we were to say that NATO forces will stay in Afghanistan indefinitely, it would probably have very negative consequences for the political process which are going on and we are all supporting. So I think what we are doing is consistent with the political process which is led by the Afghan authority, and once again we are doing it in full cooperation with the Afghan government.
Ambassador, some people, some experts believe that the basic cause, the root cause of extremism and terrorism is poverty, ignorance, and other factors. So unless you address these root causes, the phenomena of terrorism will not go away. Do you agree to that?
I think basically we need to address those causes, which is poverty, absence of education, and social insecurity. I mean, all of us have committed under the Millennium Development Goals to, by 2015, to act in different areas: eradication of poverty, support to the health of women and young children, education, water and sanitation. So we have a common set of objectives which are agreed by all members of the international community. And I think basically we are all working to achieve those Millennium Development Goals by 2015. Unfortunately, we have to be realistic. We will not necessarily meet the targets in all areas, but nevertheless, we have to reinforce our efforts and to redouble our efforts. Once again, I think France, like its European Union partners, are the major supplier worldwide of direct assistance for development, of ODA. And France, United Kingdom, Germany are among the 4 largest direct suppliers of ODA worldwide. I think only the United States are spending more than those 3 European countries. So we are quite convinced that we need to work for development. And quite clearly it is a basic requirement, not only to fight against terrorism, but to ensure proper standards of living to the population in the world.
How optimistic you are about a political settlement of the Afghan crisis, because efforts are going on behind the scene that there should be a negotiated settlement of this crisis. Sometime back we were hearing that the Taliban have started a dialogue with NATO and US. So are you hopeful that this is going to conclude and will come to the logical conclusion?
Well, we have been very supportive. I mean, when I say we, I mean France, like its European partners. We have been supportive of a political process in Afghanistan which would enable dialogue between all interested parties, with the exception of the people obviously supporting terrorism. But with this restriction, we have been supportive of a large dialogue encompassing all partners, all parties, with the view to find a stable political framework. We have also been supportive of regional arrangements which could enable all countries in the region to find proper understanding on the way to act consistently with the stability in Afghanistan. And we certainly do recognize that Pakistan has a very instrumental role to play in this regional framework. So quite clearly we need this political process. We are supportive of this political process, and we do consider it is a prerequisite for any stable government in Afghanistan.
How do you look at Pakistan's role? Pakistan has also been supportive of this process of dialogue between the NATO and American troops or the authorities and the Taliban leaders. So do you think that Pakistan's role is supportive, or some people think that Pakistan is not doing enough?
Pakistani government made very clear that it was not only supporting this process but also facilitating this process, and the statements delivered by Prime Minister Gilani in late February, by President Zardari, by Foreign Minister Rabanikar have been very clear that Pakistan is supporting this process and facilitating this process, and it's certainly in the interest of this process and in the interest of peace and stability in Pakistan and in this region.
Ambassador, will continue this discussion. नाज़रीन, एक मुख्तसर ब्रेक लेते हैं और ब्रेक से वापसी के बाद हम पाकिस्तान में फ्रांस के सफ़ीर से मज़ीद जो गुफ्तगू है वो जारी रखेंगे. Welcome back. Ambassador, there's an impression in Pakistan as well as other Islamic countries that France is curbing the Islamic values, Islamic norms, in France. And this impression is growing. What is your view on that?
I have the feeling there is a bit and lot of misunderstanding with regard to this question. And perhaps say first of all a few words on what are the basic principles in France. We have a secular state, a laic state in France, and the laws regarding these secular states were passed in 1905, more than 1 century ago, at a time when there was no Muslim communities in France, and those laws are not directed at any religion, whether it is Christian, Buddhism, Jewish, Islam. No, it's a principle of establishing a secular state. And it has been a basic principle in France for more than 1 century. Whatever the government, whether they are conservative or progressive, they have never changed those laws, which are for us really constitutional principles. I think the second point, France is, I think, the country in Europe where we have the largest Muslim community. More than 5 million or to 6 million people living in France are Muslims, which mean more or less, a bit less than 8 to 10% of the population, and it is the second largest religion in France nowadays. So it's not really an indicator of a government trying to curb or to limit Muslim population or Muslim communities. We have thousands of prayer places, mosques in the French largest cities, etc. So I have the feeling that on the very contrary, we have been trying to integrate those Muslim community within the French values, within the French legal principle. Where there is, I think, a misunderstanding is regarding the laws which were passed in France in 2010
by the Parliament
on the veil. The veil is once again perfectly allowed in France, and if you go to the major French cities, you can see in the street dozens of young ladies, Muslim young ladies, wearing a veil without any restriction or without any form of prohibition. Which is forbidden in France is a complete concealment of the face by a niqab or a burqa. Why? Because basically, in the French tradition, it is in complete contradiction with all the values on respecting women's dignity, human rights, women's dignities, and for us, our Supreme Court, our Constitutional Court, considers that any form of discrimination between men and women in this regard would be in contradiction with our basic principle. And I think there's a second reason, which is very simple, which is also a reason of security. I mean, when people are in public places in France, well, anyone has the right to see their face. So we do consider we are taking care of the religious values, because the veil, once again, is perfectly allowed in France, and any person who wants to wear a scarf of a veil can do it, and there's no restriction. The only restriction is regarding the complete concealment of the face, because we do consider, once again, it is not consistent with our basic principle. And I would like also to point out that most of the Muslim communities living in France are coming from Northern Africa or from Sub-Saharan Africa, and they can have also very different practices or different values, cultural values, than the one here or in Saudi Arabia, for example. So I think most of those communities are perfectly comfortable with those provisions, and because it is consistent with their own cultural values.
There is also an impression that not France, but generally in Europe, there is an anti-Islamic wave. Some other countries are being mentioned. You know, the cartoon issue that was there, that surfaced some time back and created a very angry reaction in the world. You think that this impression is correct, that the entire Europe is in the grip of some kind of Islamophobia?
I think, once again, Europe has always been an area of exchange of population. Well, a lot of Europeans emigrated toward other part of the world in the 19th century, and in the 20th century or 21st century, a lot of immigration came from different parts of the world to Europe. So of course all those changes need to be accommodated, and of course we have to find common way of living together with people from different parts of the world, with different cultural tradition, with different way of living. And it takes time before you find the proper common understanding in each and every European country. Once again, I mean, European countries have now large communities from Muslim countries, whether it is in Germany, in United Kingdom, in Belgium, in France, in Italy. And we have been trying to do our best for the integration of those communities in our own countries. I think part of the problem we are facing are very simply related with the economic slowdown in Europe, which make the integration of any
Little difficult.
foreign community more difficult. I mean, at the time when the European economies were booming in the 60s, 70s, 80s, well, all those problems of integration could be handled much more easily. Nowadays, we are in Europe in a situation where we are facing very high rates of unemployment for all people living there, and of course it makes integration more difficult than it could have been with better economic conditions.
There are some Pakistanis working and living in France. How do you look at the role of the Pakistani community in France?
Well, you know, the largest Pakistani community in Europe is basically in the United Kingdom. We are welcoming around, I think, 50,000 Pakistani people in France, basically in the Paris area or in some large cities. And to my knowledge, these communities seems to be integrating themselves easily in France, and we see no problem at all, on the very contrary, with those Pakistani community. But it's true that in France, these communities are very limited in number compared to other communities coming from Northern Africa or from Sub-Saharan Africa.
France has helped Pakistan a lot in the field of education. I know that higher education has been sending students for higher education in France. Will this process continue, or it will be impacted by the economic difficulties that are being confronted by France these days?
I think basically we have still a large number of Pakistani students in France, and we are continuing to develop programs of cooperation with the Higher Education Commission here in Pakistan. We have a program which is of master leading to PhD. We have also some specific programs on PhD, and we will certainly continue this cooperation because we are quite convinced that this cooperation in the area of higher education is the basis for the cooperation between the two countries in the future. And even though we are facing some economic stalemate in Europe, the budget allocated to cooperation, to ODA, is still preserved by the French government, and we want to continue those efforts of cooperation with Pakistan like with other partners.
We have to take another break. नाज़रीन, एक मुख्तसर ब्रेक लेते हैं। ब्रेक से वापसी के बाद हम पाकिस्तान में फ्रांस के सफ़ीर से मज़ीद गुफ्तगू जारी रखेंगे। फ्रांस में हाल ही में सदारती इंतखाबात हुए और एक नए सदर वहाँ मुंतखब हुए, और हम एम्बेसडर साहब से ये पूछेंगे कि जो नए सदर हैं उनकी पॉलिसी क्या होगी दुनिया के बारे में और ख़ास तौर पर पाकिस्तान के हवाले से। Welcome back. Ambassador, you've had French elections, presidential elections. You have a new president elected, and he is said to be a socialist. So do you think that there will be huge impact on the French policies between France and other major powers or Europe and elsewhere?
Well, we have a new president who was elected on the 6th of May, Mr. Hollande, and he had a very clear program. He made some proposals during the electoral campaign, and he reaffirmed his commitment to implement this program. I think he did it in a spirit of cooperation with our major partners. President Hollande, the very same day he entered into office on the 15th of May, he went to Germany, to Berlin, for
and held a joint press conference
with Chancellor Merkel. So the relationship between Germany and France, which is really one of the major pillars of European construction and of cooperation between our two countries, has been reaffirmed quite clearly, and any decision will be taken in close consultation with our EU partners. There was a summit of the European leaders yesterday night with our NATO partners, with our G8 partners. President Hollande attended the G8 summit, which took place in Camp David in the United States, and he met with President Obama just before the summit. So all these international meetings prove that we want to work in very close cooperation with our major European and economic partners worldwide. I think President Hollande put a special emphasis on growth, because he does recognize that without proper growth it would be very difficult for European economies to move out of the stalemate some European countries are facing. It is not his own vision. I mean, the G8 summit, which means the 8 largest economies in the world, so really growth was one of the main topics of the G8 summit, and President Obama made very clear that he was asking, as the members of the G8, to be trying to boost growth in the major world economies. So what we are trying to do is perfectly consistent with the views of our major partners. We have discussions going on within the European Union. It's a gathering of 27 countries, and we have decisions-making process within the EU. So we are working in order to achieve our objectives, and in order to achieve those objectives in a way which is consistent with the need of our major partners.
So the last question about Pakistan-France cooperation in the field of defense. Pakistan has had French weapon system, Mirages. You supplied us quite some time back, Augusta class submarines, and the cooperation has been going on. So what are the future prospects for this cooperation?
Well, I think, first of all, this cooperation has been going on for quite a while now, and this cooperation, as you mentioned, is still going on. But in the meanwhile, Pakistan has also developed its own capacity of producing its own weapon systems. And it's something we certainly do understand, since France has always been relying on its own defense industry for its weapon system. So the Pakistan of nowadays is not what was Pakistan 40 or 50 years ago, when Pakistan was basically importing equipment from abroad. Now you have an internal capacity of producing your own weapons, whether it is aircraft, ships, etc. So I think we have to consider that we are dealing with a different situation here in Pakistan. Pakistan has also been developing and diversifying its cooperation with some other partners, China for example, with whom you have co-production or joint ventures for some aircraft, for example. So we are in a different picture from what it used to be 30 or 40 years ago. This being said, the cooperation is going on in different areas. We have cooperation going on in the area of training also, in the area of supplying components, spare parts, etc. So we have certainly a common will to continue to have a cooperation in the area of security, in the area of defense, in the area of counterterrorism, but taking into account the fact that Pakistan has nowadays a mature defense industry, which was not the case 40 or 50 years ago. So I think we have to consider what can be the cooperation in a context which is different from what it used to be when we supplied Mirage or other weapon systems.
थैंक यू मिस्टर नाज़रीन, आज हमारे इस प्रोग्राम में पाकिस्तान में फ़्रांस के सफ़ीर ने गुफ्तगू की है पाकिस्तान और फ़्रांस के ताल्लुकात के हवाले से, अफ़गानिस्तान की सूरत हाल के हवाले से, पाकिस्तान और फ़्रांस दहशत गर्दी के ख़िलाफ़ जंग में जो ताउन कर रहे हैं उस पर उन्होंने इज़हार ख्याल किया है, और उन्होंने इस इम्प्रेशन को ज़ायल करने की कोशिश की है कि फ़्रांस इस्लामी अक़दार के मुनाफी कोई इक़दाम कर रहा है। उन्होंने इसके ऊपर बात की है और उन्होंने इस तवक़्क़ो का इज़हार किया है कि पाकिस्तान और फ़्रांस के दरमियान मुस्तक़बिल में भी दिफ़ाई शोबे में और मईशत के शोबे में ताउन जो है वो बरकरार रहेगा। इसी के साथ ये प्रोग्राम ख़त्म होता है। जावेद सिद्दीक़ को इजाज़त दीजिए। खुदा हाफ़िज़। Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to talk to you.
A pleasure indeed. Thank you.